So welcome everyone to our program, An Evening with Cathy Park Hong, author of Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning. This program is brought to you by 21 Chicago area libraries. I'm Roz Topolsky with the Vernon Area Public Library, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sam Adams Lanham from the Barrington Area Library. And we are thrilled to have such strong interest in this program, both from the libraries and from our readers. We're using the webinar version of Zoom this evening, so you can put your questions for Cathy into the Q&A. We'll take questions at the conclusion of the program, but please put your questions in the Q&A as you think of them. If you have technical questions, then please put them in the chat and we'll help you from there. Tonight's program is being recorded, so you'll receive a link with the recording by early next week, and you can feel free to share it with other people that you think would be interested in hearing this conversation. We are very grateful for the support of several local independent booksellers, and I will put a link with their information in the chat once we get started. And at the end of the evening, you'll see a survey on your screen, and we hope that you'll just take a minute to fill it out and so that we can have your feedback. So now I'd like to introduce you to our two guests for tonight. First, we have Monica Eng. Monica is a Chicago reporter for Axios. For more than 3 decades, Monica has covered Chicago food, culture, policy, history, health, and the environment. She has reported for the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Tribune, and most recently, WBEZ Public Radio. And Cathy Park Hong is the New York Times best-selling author of Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning. Minor Feelings was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography, and caught the attention of Time magazine and earned Cathy a spot on this year's Times 100 Most Influential People list. Cathy's prose and poetry have been published in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Guardian, and Paris Review, among others. She is the poetry editor of the New Republic and is a full professor at Rutgers Newark University. Minor Feelings received fantastic reviews as soon as it was published. I'm just going to share 2 reviews with you now to give you a sense about the impact of the book. According to NPR, Minor Feelings is a major reckoning, pulling no punches as the author uses her life's flashpoints to give voice to a wider Asian American experience, one with cascading consequences. And according to Time magazine, Cathy Park Hong's voice is urgent and raw as she unpacks what it's like to experience prejudice that doesn't fit into the exact mold of oppression faced by other minorities in the US. Hong is brutally self-aware and embraces her anger as she captures how she struggled to make sense of her identity. So Monica and Cathy, welcome to our webinar. We are just really delighted to have you both with us tonight, and I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight virtually to hear this, what I think is going to be a really exciting discussion with Cathy and me. I'll just be asking the questions and channeling some of your questions. I really hope that everyone has a book like this with lots of post-it notes and lots of questions and lots of annotation, because it's such a fascinating book, bringing up so many interesting points. I think one person who talked to Cathy said she puts into words things that we sort of felt but just didn't know how to say. So without further ado, Cathy, just for those who maybe haven't dug into your biography or the book yet, what are some important things to know about you to understand where you're coming from and to understand this book? I think you're still on mute.
God, I keep doing that. It's such a rookie mistake, and yet I keep doing it. I guess that, a lot of my biography is in the book, but it's not, it's not necessarily a memoir. It's a strange hybrid of memoir, cultural criticism, history. It's both supposed to be, it's in one of my essays, I say that to write about race is both a polemic and a lyric. And that is sort of what Minor Feelings is that it's both a lyric and a polemic. And so going off of that, I will say that um, it's a very subjective perspective of being Asian American in America, and and the perspective that I'm going at it from is I'm a poet. I'm a poet. I grew up in LA. I was born and raised in LA. I guess you could call me a Gen Xer. Maybe I'm a little bit, no, I'm pretty much a Gen Xer. And, so that was like, grew up in LA during the 80s and 90s, and second generation Korean American, was bad at math, was really into, always wanted to be in the arts since, I could lift up a pencil or a pen or something. So I think that it's very important to note that, this book is not at all representative or is somehow supposed to be a definitive compendium on Asian American history. It's very much a strange, subjective perspective on being Asian, and a lot of that has to do. The book has a lot to do with, in a certain way, it's like a portrait of an Asian American poet, which is what I am. So a lot of it was also kind of leaning towards sort of my coming of age as a creative person, and dealing with some of the exclusionary practices in American letters and stuff. So I could start from there. I mean, I don't know if that's, we could talk more about who I am as we continue our conversation.
I think it's super helpful. I think it's helpful to the audience. Again, if you haven't already read it, read it. But I think it's a good launching point. I'm so glad you said bad at math, because, and we can get into the whole stereotypes about Asians. But whenever I would go to the Asian American Journalism Association conference, there'd always be some jokester who gets up at the podium. I think we all know why we're all here today. And they'd say, because we didn't get into the engineering school or the law school or the medical school, or we're bad at math, so we're all journalists. And that's why we become writers. But I think you get to the point, the whole model minority, that the Asian Americans are a certain type of person, because that's so much of who we were told we were, who our parents told us we were, and what society told us we were. And I totally want to get into that, but I didn't want to miss the sort of this really fascinating question. I thought it's that I heard that you were thinking about, doing this in verse as a poem at one point, and then you were like, no, this has got to be nonfiction, which wasn't your medium of choice that much. How did that work?
First of all, I've had experience with prose, actually, right after I graduated from college, I did dabble in journalism. I was a fact checker, and I wrote for the Village Voice.
Oh,
And and it was a really that was, when the paper was actually regarded as important, and it was covering a lot of it was during Giuliani's tenure in New York City, and when he was a mayor.
before he went mad?
Huh?
Before he went mad?
He was mad that back then. New Yorkers just knew what we were,
Before
what
everybody
the
else.
rest of America was getting into. but and so the newspaper, so the newspaper was covering the police brutality, the killing of Diallo and so forth back then. So I had experience with journalism before I pursued poetry, before I went to grad school for poetry. I have also written book reviews, I've written criticism and so forth. So I wasn't entirely new to prose, but my primary mode of expression was poetry. I wrote 3 collections of poems, and I was teaching poetry, and at some point, and I was also always interested in writing. I always all of my poetry dealt with race or immigration or colonialism in one sense or another. But then I was like, I wanted to I always like to challenge myself by, I always love to make my life more difficult that way. And I realized that I was afraid. I realized I was afraid of writing autobiographically. And so I tried to do that with poetry. I was like, okay, I'm going to really write personally about race as it applies to my life or how I grew up. And I wanted to do it both sincerely, but also satirically. And it just wasn't coming through via poetry. I think like whenever I tried to write satirically via poetry, I had a few poems published. A few of those poems published, readers were taking it seriously. And I just, I realized I needed more room to spread out. Like I needed to really kind of, I needed to write in sentences to do that. And also, I realized that poetry wasn't the right medium to make an argument. And I wanted to make an argument. The more I was thinking about this, the more I realized I wanted to kind of stage an intervention and set the record straight, act as a kind of a corrective against all of the kind of falsities that I grew up with about being Korean, being Asian, being a woman of color, all of that, and just like, I just wanted to kind of clear the bullshit, and so that's why I wrote Minor Feelings. And it's also much more accessible than my poetry, because I just wanted to kind of again, for that reason, I just wanted to clear the air, and I just wanted to kind of not only explain to people, the audience, but explain to myself, ask myself these questions of um, um, what the Asian American condition is there an Asian American consciousness, how does being Asian American fit into this kind of racial capitalist history of the US, and all of that.
You mentioned Asian American, and when you go to the Asian American Journalism Association, you get conferences. You get a lot of people talking about, yes, there are similarities, but we are not a monolith, and there are tons of differences. And there was even a session: is Asian American a useful term anymore? How do you feel about that?
I think it's just we tend to get caught up in this like sort of Ouroboros of like qualifications, like before you say anything about being Asian American, before you say anything about being Asian American, you have to kind of list a litany of how you're not speaking for all Asian Americans, and you're only speaking from this kind of demographic, and you're not speaking for that kind of demographic, and so forth. And after a while, it gets a little tiresome. And I don't know. I think a lot of the disparateness that we're talking about can also apply to most minorities. You could say the same thing with Latinos, right? Except even with Latinos, I mean, they have a shared language, but then there's also racial disparities among Latinos, much more so than Asian Americans. So these problems are applicable to all different races, I guess, even Black Americans, because, are we talking about, in a way, no, because of course, Black Americans are very different from Asian Americans because of the history of slavery and dispossession, segregation, mass incarceration, and so forth. But at the same time, the Black diaspora is also quite varied. I would say but I sort of see Asian Americans, you can see them as variegated and having, common sensibilities at the same time. Like, Guattari once said, you know, called something as a plurality of disparate groups coming together in a kind of unified disunity, a pragmatic solidarity without solidity. And I think that's sort of a nice way of like kind of describing the kind of commonalities and some contradictions of being Asian American, that there's a kind of, you can have a unified disunity. And also, I sort of see Asian American, back to its original term, which is when it was coined in 1968 by these UC Berkeley Asian American activists, where they didn't see it as a prescriptive label. What they saw they saw it more as something that was a term that it was more aspirational, not aspirational in a capitalist sense, but like aspirational as in they saw Asian American as a, a, an oppositional group, an oppositional identity, kind of like the way a lot of LGBTQ groups sees queer as an oppositional identity. It's like it's a term that's resisting whatever hegemons that are working against them. And that way you don't have to see Asian American as this kind of binding label, but as as a sensibility that's resistant.
Thanks. One of the reasons I guess this was originally booked was some of the organizers had been looking at the hate crimes against Asian Americans in the last year, and that certainly was after you'd written this. What were you thinking when you saw? I mean, obviously there were hate crimes before, and there unfortunately will be after, but the big spate of them at that time. How did that strike you at the time?
I was definitely I mean, I was upset, I guess. I mean, and it's still happening. It hasn't gone away, I mean, it's just, I mean, this is the problem with media, is that they treat these like
Focus in at one time and then pretend.
these hate incidents as like happening during one year, and then it just disappears. But it doesn't disappear. It's just the cameras have turned elsewhere. Just tonight there was a woman who was beaten up in the subway, and she was an East Asian woman. I found it very it was very upsetting. I mean, yes, the book came out beforehand. I was very it was, I wouldn't say I was upset, angry, maybe confused. I wouldn't say I was necessarily surprised because this has happened. I mean, this kind of hate or discrimination, or just the way Asian Americans are treated in America was something that I was exposed to when I was a kid, right? Or that I saw happening to my parents, and I wrote about it in the book. Like, I write about how My grandmother, for instance, was, kicked to the ground by some white kids, and or I've seen where I talked about how my parents were disrespected by white adults, and so it was, and that was the most painful part of growing up, was not even my own, the kind of, and these are not microaggressions, by the way. They were not, it wasn't like, kids taunting me in a recess, or it wasn't even like kids taunting me about what I brought for lunch. It was much more hurtful than that. It was like seeing my parents or my grandmother just absolutely humiliated, and so when it was happening, but I think like what happens as you grow older, I think if you're anyone who's someone of color, if you're able to do it, if you have the privilege to do it, is to kind of leave the premises in which you were exposed to that. So it's like if you grew up in a small town, or like, where there was no one like you. I moved to, I mean, I grew up in LA, but like, I'm in New York City, moving to New York City and finding like-minded people and finding a community and so forth. So I think for a little while I shielded myself from that. And then when I saw that happening again, it did remind me, especially when the elderly were being attacked, that this has always happened, but now there was more permission, I guess, for it to happen in public. But racism is never new. It just comes in new forms. It just gets reproduced in different ways throughout history. So this anti-Asian hate or discrimination, or whatever you want to call it, has always been around since Asians first started coming here, and maybe it's subsided a little bit. We don't know for sure. Probably not, but it'll come back. Um, what I found really galvanizing, though, is how so many Asian Americans, younger Asian Americans, are galvanized, and I think we're still seeing what's going to happen. We're going to see what's going to happen with Asian Americans, and how they're going to be politicized. I think it's a little too early to tell, but I was also very buoyed by the fact that Michelle Wu, for instance, won mayor for Boston, and I think she's a great representative of a new kind of Asian American politician, one who is for restorative justice and the Green New Deal and for workers' rights. And I'm like, and I think that, it's definitely mobilized a lot of people, a lot of Asians, and in a way that complicates the identity, and that also looks deeper into allyship.
Yeah, I was so thrilled to see it. She's a Chicago girl from Chicago,
Mhm.
and then raised in the suburbs, but making good in Boston. We also have Teresa Ma, who's our state representative here. So slowly but surely, you are seeing East Asian women, especially, get into politics. Um, my grandfather came here 100 years ago. So one side of my family went into restaurants, the other went into grocery stores in the South. And the reason why they went into grocery stores in the Deep South was because whites would not sell to African Americans. And so the Chinese became the intermediaries. They opened all the groceries. And but they still couldn't go, like my great aunts couldn't go to school there. They had separate schools for
Mhm.
colored, Chinese. And so Asians have long occupied this weird limbo space that you write about. Can you talk more about that and how that plays out in interactions, in our own view of ourselves, in where we fit in this pecking order of color?
It's very yeah, sure. I mean, I think this Asian American scholar Claire Jean Kim wrote a classic essay about it. And, I guess we've always been in this kind of triangulated relationship, where between Asians, and Black Americans, where, Asians are uh, often used as a wedge, and we're often compared, we're also often compared to be to blacks as being black people as being the more favorable minority, but then when push comes to shove, we're still not as good as uh, white Americans. I mean, when you talk about your family, and I write a little bit about the LA riots, and that kind of parallels your family's experience, where in the book I talk about how um, you know a lot of Koreans moved into South Central and opened up grocery stores. It was a food desert there. There were no grocery stores, no, very little retail and so forth, because of redlining, because Black people throughout history couldn't get the business loans, right, to open up their own stores. Meanwhile, during that time, um, their manufacturing dried up. Jobs left. There were no jobs. There was a lot of real estate when during the Great Migration. Afterwards, when Black people moved to LA, they were not allowed to live in the West Side or any other parts, and they were all kind of congested in South Central. So there was, like all Chicago, for instance, there was urban neglect, there was urban neglect. And then after 1965, which was the Hart-Celler Act, that was when immigration was opened up to the rest of the world, Asians and Latinos and Africans. That was when my family came. That was when Asian Americans that was when Asian Americans really diversified in this country. And that was when Koreans came in, and through their own personal loan system called Key, and through business loans, there were Koreans who opened up these stores, and there was a lot of tension between them and so forth. But then when the LA riots happened, a lot of the kind of scapegoating was pinioned on those Korean merchants, who were, a lot of them were also working class. A lot of them were also trying to get by. And also when the LA riots was happening, the police cordoned off Koreatown, South Central, and so forth, allowed everything to burn down. Meanwhile, they were protecting the west side of LA, the white side of LA. They were protecting Beverly Hills, they were protecting Sherman Oaks, all the white side. And meanwhile, they had, the K-Town, South Central, all, downtown, that part where all, brown people, Black people, Asians, they just let it burn down. So I think that kind of gives you sort of the complexities of sort of the different power dynamics of between Asians and Black Americans and so forth. But I think it also depends, let me just say this one more, but I think it also depends on the kind of Asian demographic you come from. There's a huge difference between, say, if you're like Chinese American or Korean American working at Silicon Valley, and Black people who lived in East Palo Alto, and then also, or if you're Hmong, and you come from, you're Hmong refugee living in the projects with other Black people in Minneapolis, you know. So it's just, I also don't want to kind of collapse all different groups under this sort of triangulated relationship that I'm talking about.
Yeah, it is complicated, and you always have to have those, disclaimers and qualifiers, but there are, I never thought of those parallels between, yeah, post-slavery South, and then, the grocery stores and the Asians playing the middleman, and then and LA, where the Asians again were playing the grocery middleman. I never thought of that. It's fascinating and scary that, that things would replicate themselves. And actually, during the riots this summer in Chicago, there were a lot of Korean wig shops and phone stores on the south and west side that also got damaged during the riots. And one of our reporters at BZ was looking at that. And I hadn't realized that. I had done some stories about the Korean community, but I'd forgotten about all the commerce they had in those African American neighborhoods. Well, switching gears a tiny bit, there is a lot to be, worried about in terms of Asian Americans and their interface with whiteness. But I wonder if there's something to be hopeful about in things like Squid Game, Parasite, Michelle Wu, your book and its success with, largely, well, not Michelle Wu, but Korean Americans bringing up in creative ways these really compelling arguments about class and about capitalism, and we're eating it up. What do you make of that?
I don't know. I think it's, I don't know if I would pair what's happening, what is it, like what's happening in Korea with what some Korean Americans are doing. I will say that there's a lot of really exciting Asian Americans writers who are coming out with books and have been coming out with books, and they're getting more recognition, like C. Pam Ju, or or God, no, there's so many, like Monica Sok, who's a poet, or Divya Victor. I'm a poet, so I'm going more towards poetry than fiction, but it's really, I think it's a renaissance of Asian American writers. And it is exciting, and it is exciting to see how Americans have been responding to just Korea's soft, I guess they call it soft power, right? Like the Squid Game and Parasite and all of that. I think what, I think what's coming out of Korea has been going on for a while. And they've also been subsidized by the Korean government, because they know the importance of soft power. I also think, like, there's something, I'm writing about this right now, actually, in the way that, I don't want to get too wonky about this, but the way that the Cold War and American imperialism has affected Korea and other Asian countries. But, I think that because Korea is such a small country, South Korea is such a tiny country, and because it's become progressively more and more neoliberal since the 1998 IMF crisis. I feel like it's like Korea is like a canary in a coal mine. So whatever repercussions from capitalism that Korea suffers, it will happen in America 5 years later or 10 years later. So for instance, like in Korea, like, this is a stupid example, Koreans were taking selfies, like 7 years before it was being, Americans were taking selfies. But I think, when there was more the gig economy hit Korea really badly, and faster and earlier there than it did in the States. And so I think there were a lot of movies and that were addressing that, that inequality, that great inequality. And, and now I guess America is catching on to that, so it's exciting. I'm really proud to be a Korean American, right? I'm really proud to uh, be a part of that, I guess. Although like what's coming out in Asian America and what's coming out in Korea is, I think, has like sort of different origins. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, true. I remember an editor in the 90s or maybe early 2000s came back from Seoul and he's like, they watch movies on their phones. You can't believe it. They're on the train and they can watch a movie on their phone. I think
Mm-hmm.
America might be doing that at one point. And I was like, wow, you're right. Like 5 years later, we actually had the ability to do it.
Yeah.
They are far ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting. And I think that like, I don't know, I tend to be an optimist. I think that of course, Asian Americans are such a disparate group, but at the same time, one note of hope that I saw was that, after the 2020 election, among 18 to 29-year-olds, Asian Americans, they voted blue second to Black Americans, 18 to 29-year-old Black Americans. So, while there are certain groups like immigrants who are still staunchly Republican, there are also like the younger generation, in general, are leaning left. They're turning left, and I think a lot of that has been inspired by, of course, climate change, but also Black Lives Matter, and also our shit economy and all of that, and I think and I definitely have seen it from my students for a long, long time, where they're just much more racially conscious, very much more activists, just like really fierce generation of folks,
My daughter actually interviewed a lot of Asian Americans who were talking to their parents about race and saying, it's really problematic the way you talk about race, then issues of anti-Blackness. But the younger generation she saw was really trying to talk to the older generation about it, and they saw it as a major break from that generation. We got a question during registration. There are a ton right now, so I do not want to go over time because I want you to be able to get to the questions that people are watching. But they asked, how can minor feelings be used as a catalyst for building power and community organizing?
I don't know if that's up to me to answer. I think that's like, I say this again, like, I started as a poet and I'm still a poet, and I'm not so much an organizer or or a social worker or a therapist and so forth. So I'm not really quite sure how to answer that, but I will say that from the responses that I've gotten about the book, which has been really incredible and really humbling, is that I have, people have started up a lot of book clubs, a lot of women especially. They turn to the book to read the book. And I think what I found really inspiring is how they really related to it personally. And what readers have told me is that they were not only able to see through their alienation, they were able to see their alienation, but also see through their alienation and see how that alienation was actually structural, that it wasn't just them feeling that way, and they no longer felt alone. And I think that is a great step, right? First of all, to understand that your estrangement is not just you, that it's felt by others, and because of that, it's not your fault. It's something that's probably societal or political. And from there, once you have that kind of recognition of your estrangement, can there be actually some move towards political organization and so forth? I have had, I think what's also been really great is to have these sort of multiracial kind of uh, uh, organizing where people have read the book, also um, Black folks who've also read the book and have told me they've had a deeper understanding of what it's like to be Asian American, and that's been also really incredible. And so for me, I think it's really for me, I think what's been really productive and interesting is it, you know, if coalition building is always really uncomfortable and difficult, but I think when you're building coalitions between races, between classes, between genders, or whatever, it's always to get together, but first have a reading list, and read as many history books or memoirs or poetry or fiction before you start the discussion, so you come armed. I mean, not armed, but you come with some knowledge. And I think someone who had a lot of experience with coalition building said that, and I would hope that maybe Minor Feelings could be in that reading list, in that kind of before one enters a room and start talking, having that difficult conversation.
For sure. Another registered person asks, any advice for Asian American kids struggling with identity?
In terms of accepting their own identity.
I think that's what they meant. I wish I.
I would say that.
Like, am I Asian? Am I American? What parts do I take? Who can I be?
I would say that if you're feeling any kind of confusion or self-loathing, and say that it gets better, and that, if you're not finding that community right now in your high school or your junior high school, it's your community is out there in college or online and so forth, and you'll find empowerment as you find others. What would you say? I think I need a more specific question.
Yeah, I wish I could go to the person and ask kind of more specifically what they're looking for. It's kind of broad, but I don't think there is an answer. I think everyone is going to feel differently. Everyone is going to feel this Asian or that Asian or this American or that American in different situations, and you just have to explore and grow into it. It's terribly imprecise.
I think it's a right now. I would say, and this is me being hopeful again, is a better. It's I think it's an more open environment to be a racialized other than it was when I was growing up, because the communities are there. I mean, even when with my 7-year-old daughter, the kinds of Pixar movies that she's watching is completely different than, the stuff that I watched. But, I got a question like that before, where someone asked me that their sister who's adopted is Korean, and that she wanted nothing to do with Asian culture. And she keeps trying to encourage her to listen to, I don't know, read Asian American books and so forth, and she just refuses. And you can't force that on them. You just can't. I think the more you try to force that on them, the more they're going to resist, because teenagers are teenagers, and they're going to resist whatever their authority is going to say. But the resources are now there, and they're going to find it in their own time, as long as maybe it's more, making sure to nurture their curiosity and nurture, and also make sure that they're loved and cared for. And they'll find those resources, if not when they're a teenager, when they, maybe a little bit later in their adult life,
Okay, we're just about at time, and I'll give you a nice, easy, short question when we have 1 minute left. How do I support the Asian American community?
I would say, first of all, listen, understand, don't interrupt, read as many books by Asian Americans as possible. But I think beyond, there is also this kind of a problem, and this is not just white people. I think this applies to all minorities, where, a lot of it is just, when people say, how can I be an ally? It's more about like self-education more than anything else. And I think, it starts with self-education, but it doesn't end with self-education. So yes, you go through the anti-racist reading list, but then what else can you do from there? And I think it's like really important to support initiatives after you do that, support initiatives that help Asian American rights, whether it's like, fighting against gentrification in Chinatown in your local city, or like, or if you're trying to be there for, Black, brown, working class kids and so forth, to like, uh, support your local schools and go to public, public school, instead of, funneling all your resources to a private school. I would say the same thing for being, for Asian Americans, for supporting Asian Americans to do the reading, do your homework, and understand and listen, but also just try to find ways to support initiatives, support groups, learn more about like undocumented Asian American, workers. One other example, the Atlanta massacre kind of came and went. And there's been nothing about, no articles about like what, the kind of invisible sex workers, which make up a significant portion of Asian Americans. And there's been no follow-up, no feature follow-up there, or there was maybe a couple, but support groups that help these workers, for instance. If you, for instance, you feel sorry for what happened to the Asian women who were massacred.
Right, and on a sort of more concrete level, there are a lot of bystander trainings that are still available for those.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those are really, really. I felt like
That was what was really kind of disturbing and unsettling, was that in the beginning, when there were these anti-Asian hate crimes or bias crimes, and and it was filmed, there was no one helping out, no one doing anything, and it was really alienating and very lonely to see. And I think there is like bystander training that you can do. But I also have seen lots of, heard about or read about lots of instances where people are now standing up and helping, and all of that.
For sure. Well, thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn it over to Sam, who will read some questions from the audience.
Great, thank you so much. We were talking amongst some of the librarians that you give fantastic long answers, like at the drop of a hat. It's very impressive. And I do just want to share with the audience, we received, between the questions that were submitted prior to the event and the ones that were submitted during the event, we've received over 40. So we are not going to be able to get to all of the questions. And we'll share things, like a few people put some book suggestions out, we'll do our best to share those when we share the video. So a couple of things. First, and again, Michelle Wu, I have been informed by some of my colleagues from the Barrington area that I must mention that she is a product of the Barrington school system. She went to elementary, middle, and high school in the Barrington area before she went to Harvard. So we are also very proud of her and very invested.
Amazing.
So, yeah, it's really fun. So this is a question that came up during your talk. And I'm just going to read it in its entirety. So it's a little long. It says, you've explained the conflict of needing to prove yourself as a poet with regard to catering to a white audience or panel or system. Did you feel similarly when writing your book, or has it been an entirely different experience? Are you sitting with any unexpected emotions in response to the deservedly widespread positive attention you have received for your book? And they close by saying, thank you for writing a book that makes people like me feel seen for the first time.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. I'm sorry, the
I
first,
can
repeat it one more time.
So the first part of the question was, when you're writing poetry, needing to prove yourself, right? And did you feel the same way when writing the book, or was it a different experience?
No, it was a different experience, because I think when, as a poet, I was, in the book, I wasn't thinking so much of an audience as more as an institution, or I was just thinking about posterity, because no one reads poetry, and I write experimental poetry. So I'm like, well, maybe 100 years from now, people will read my poetry and, it'll be canonized or blah, blah, blah. But, but of course that institution is codified in whiteness, or just sort of, in a highly academic sense. When I wrote Minor Feelings, I was writing it, I had a completely different perspective on it. I was writing it, first of all, for myself, for my daughter, when she was, for her to read when she was older. I was writing it for people like me who felt estranged and didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it, and so forth. And by people like me, I don't mean like other Korean American women necessarily. It's just other, primarily other racialized groups that have felt the same kind of minor feelings that I have had. So I was really kind of purposely not trying to write it. I was actually it gave me a certain amount of glee to give a middle finger to what white people were expecting, the kind of Asian American narratives that white people were expecting. It gave me a certain kind of pleasure not to write in that way. So I wasn't pandering, and I was very lucky enough that, sometimes, of course, hear a lot of horror stories about how Asian Americans or other writers of color have white publishers who expect them to kind of water down their work and everything. And I was privileged to have a young editor who is Japanese American, and then the editor who took over, that was Victory Mitsui, and the editor who took over was Chris Jackson, who's a publisher of One World, who's Black. So and their mission is always, their mission has always been publishing books that kind of upended or kind of upended these dominant narratives that sort of these hegemonic narratives that sort of undermine racialized experiences. So I was in the right place for it. I was in the right family for it. And so I didn't feel like I was pandering. That having said that, because of that, I feared that no one was going to read it, and I was sure of it. It gave me a lot of anxiety to know that, because, I was writing about an invisible race, that the book itself was going to be invisible.
Which is really, that kind of leads into the second question that this individual asked, which is, are you sitting with any unexpected emotions in a response to the widespread positive
I
attention?
don't know. I think it's sort of, I'm still the neurotic poet who feels like an underdog and feels that no one's gonna. I mean, it's like I've been like, I think it would have been different if I had this kind of success when I was like 25 or something, or 27. But I'm 45. And I have had a lot of rejections along the way. So, and so it's kind of strange that it's happening. And also during the pandemic, when there's been a lot of grief and anger and, and just, unresolved mourning, and for my book to take off like that during that time, certainly I feel both elated and happy, but also ambivalent. And but it makes me feel really good that some readers have been able to rely on that book as to help them through this difficult time. That does make me feel really good. I also hope that and expect that after this book, as there have been before this book, that there'll be a lot more books who will kind of continue on or complicate or expand the conversation.
Okay. And that actually, I was thinking that's kind of like almost analogous to the body dysmorphia that you talk about in the book, that having been shaped this way for so long, it's hard to see how much things have blossomed.
I have like manuscript dysmorphia. Like, when I was saying this to my editor, like I hate printing out my manuscript out, because then when I see the cold print in the cold light of day, I feel like it's just horrible no matter what, so but I've accepted it. I've accepted it. It just takes me a little while to get used to.
Yeah. So that would be, I'd be interested to hear, you mentioned do the reading, do the work. Are there book suggestions that you would offer to the audience?
Oh, about anything or related to?
I think maybe anti-racism, learning more about the Asian experience, and then anti-racism. I'll say those two things. I do not know if that is what the call.
I was a book that it was just shortlisted actually for the National Book Award that I've been championing is Grayson Cho's Tastes Like War. And when people have been asking me this in relation to like, how do I kind of process what's been happening on for the last year or two? And I think that book is just so gorgeous. It's about this author's schizophrenic mother. She's half Korean, and her mother's was schizophrenic, and she found out that her mother was a prostitute when she was in Korea, and she married her father, who was an American soldier, white American soldier in Korea, and then they moved to Oregon, the rural Oregon, and they had her, and it was just like really heartbreaking book. And she had schizophrenia. Schizophrenia actually affects immigrants, and especially immigrant women, I think like 3 times more. I could be wrong, 3 times more than other people, because I think that disease is environmental. So she writes about that, and she writes about sex work, and she writes about just well, how a lot of this kind of Asian female fetishization, sexualization is tied to Americans going on American overseas adventures, the wars and the forever wars and so forth. And she writes about that all so beautifully. So that's a book I would recommend. I would recommend Divya Victor's Curb, CURB. These are more recent books. She's a South Asian poet, and it's just, I love it. It's just a beautiful book. And then also a little bit older one is Jeff Chang's Can't Stop, Won't Stop. I just love his work. And Sien Nai, Ugly Feelings, which a book that I'm very indebted to. So those are some examples.
Okay. That's great. I'm writing as fast as I can to make sure we catch all of them. There is another question that came in from someone that I think it's a very specific situation, but speaks to a general challenge. So I'll summarize the first part of this. The questioner is Asian with a name that is distinctly Asian. And they were at their child's school doing a check-in, and they asked them to repeat their name and spell their name over and over and over again. And kind of said, what's going on? Why is this so hard for you? They said, oh, we had an update to our system. Everybody's going through this. Don't take it personally. And she said, I have a hard time with that. I don't know how to verbalize why it's offensive. Many other incidents like this happen, and I always question myself. Am I supposed to be offended, or am I overreacting? Which I feel is very typical for Asians. What advice do you have for someone like me that has a hard time labeling my feelings in situations like this? How do I fact check myself that this is indeed upsetting for me?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very vulnerable question, a brave question to ask. I think that this is what I try to kind of articulate in the book, is that I think it's this is the way it is for all groups, marginalized groups, but it is kind of in an insidious way for Asian Americans, where we are sort of conditioned to minimize whatever insults or slights or actual macro aggressions that we endure, and we're supposed to not think that it's just in our head and it's not actually really happening. And I think that if your body feels it, that it's true. You're not making it up. It's like that. So believe in yourself when you know that you are being aggressed against, or someone is insulting you or offending you in some way. And I think for I have very few regrets in my life, but one of the few regrets that I do have is that, when you're a young Asian woman, you deal with a lot of people's bullshit, and you just take it in and you think you always feel like you're not allowed to kind of sling back at it, or just boomerang back, and say that I'm not going to take your bullshit. And one thing that's been very gratifying, and that I don't even think about anymore, is I don't take people's bullshit anymore, and that I'm just very firm and direct, and I just put people in their place. And I did this before Minor Feelings came out or anything like that, and I think that if you feel it and you believe it, don't doubt yourself. Don't doubt yourself. Don't second guess yourself. Be firm, be direct. You're a future you will thank you for it.
Yeah. And your children, right?
Yeah,
Seeing
and
you
your children.
stand
Yes.
up. Yeah. A little bit of me wanted to tweak the last question, how do I fact check myself that this is indeed upsetting? Like, it's upsetting. There's no fact check necessary.
Yeah.
But yeah, I understand the sense that they were trying to get at. So let's see. This is one that came in prior to the conversation. You mentioned the book that Richard Pryor is an inspiration to you. Are there other authors, artists, performers that inspire you? And I have an adjunct to that as well once you're done.
Richard, performers and artists. I mean, I love.
They say authors, artists, performers.
Oh, I mean, I could just rattle off more authors and artists I love. Oh my God, where do I even start? Fred Moten is someone who I love. His books, Black and Blur, Undercommons. I love Sadia Hartman. Wayward Lives is the book that I would recommend. Performers, I love Ali Wong, Bowen Yang, in terms of comedians. There was a period when I got really into comedy, stand-up comedy. This was like before, around the time that I got into Richard Pryor. And then I have these obsessions, and then unfortunately, once I write about my obsession, I sort of move on from it. So I haven't really been watching it as much stand-up comedy. I think stand-up comedy has taken a bit of a hit since the Dave Chappelle special, but I still, I still love it, and I'm a big fan of Ali Wong. Artists, Carol Walker, Ruth Asawa. There's so many. Like, I feel like I should have just write down a list of names and just just copy it onto the chat box, so you're not furiously scribbling, or I'm not like, just grasping for names when there's so many that I feel like I should say. Yeah, but those are just a few. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and interestingly, the adjunct to that question that was asked by a different questioner, but felt like they kind of went together to me was, thank you for your illuminating, unexpected, and moving chapter on stand-up comedy. If you've seen Dave Chappelle's show, would you share your insights about his work?
I didn't watch it.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't.
fair.
I'm like, I don't need to. I just. I can't comment, and I think I can't say anything that has been already been written by actually a lot of Black queer writers, Black queer folks who just really rightly nailed Dave Chappelle for his just deep homophobia. I think that he also made a crack against Asians, or about being COVID, and but I haven't watched it, and I just
Yeah.
I can't comment on it. Just read. I would just say listen to the people who already have and seen it. Yeah.
I think that's fair, and it's especially during COVID, it's a way of taking care of yourself to sometimes not take in all the media that's available.
Yeah.
So again, I think this will be the last question that I will ask from here. And as I said, I think I did 4, which means there's 30 some that we didn't get to, and I'm sorry. But we can't keep Cathy on the phone. It's an hour later where she is. So, and this is, you are a college professor. You mentioned in the book seeing that the students in your classes are doing better at talking about race. If you were teaching younger people, elementary, middle, high school, how would you approach discussions of race and identity with various age groups?
I don't know. Oh my God. I think that's I think elementary school teachers, middle school teachers, and high school teachers have some of the hardest jobs, and they have like a whole skill set that I lack teaching college. In fact, I would say my job is easier being a college professor because first of all, I don't have to deal with parents and as much. And then second of all, like I feel freer to teach whatever I want. I will say that I find this sort of trumped up uh, critical race theory scam to be really quite frightening. And when it popped up, when it was happening earlier this year, I just refused to kind of engage with it because it seemed so ridiculous as QAnon. But now it does seem like it's just like QAnon, it's spreading, and that this is like the latest iterations of the GOP using white racial anxiety to kind of get Republicans to vote against their own or not just white. It's not just white, by the way. It's also other people of color as well, to vote against their own economic interests and vote for vote for them, by drumming up all this racial anxiety and fear. And for that reason, I think, we need to double down, and I think as college professors and elementary school and middle school and so forth, I would say, I don't know. I don't really know what is considered sort of age appropriate for the books to have these kind of to have a multicultural curriculum. All I know is that I'll just say this, maybe because I haven't taught schools, I will say how I felt when I was a student. When I was in middle school and high school, I did not read a single Asian American poet or writer. I read one Toni Morrison book, and for that I was grateful, The Bluest Eye. But other than that, I never read a single person of color, which is why I never felt like I had a permission to be a writer. And in the history books, it still affects me how there was not even a paragraph on Asian American history on the Japanese internment camp. Maybe it was mentioned in a couple sentences, or the first Chinese immigrants who came here, or nothing about the Chinese Exclusion Act, none of that. And also the Korean War. All that was said about the Korean War was that Americans were fighting communism, and they, basically they were the white saviors who saved Korea, and neglected to mention that 3 million people died in Korea. And I think it would have really, and this may be considered negative or not empowering or whatever, but if I knew that, I think that would have really kind of strengthened my sense of self and strengthened my own sort of critical knowledge of this country and who I am and so forth. So I think that, I don't know when it's good, but I don't think it's just important to teach like the empowering, like, yay, I am Asian and I am a powerful woman, but also the truth of American history. That can be empowering, not just for students of color, but for white students as well, to kind of not placate them or pander to them, and really kind of show them how to really think about the different histories, American histories.
Yeah. Someone commented in chat, the TEACH Act was just passed in Illinois to make sure these stories and histories are included in the curriculum. And actually, I know there is a school librarian on that panel as well. So which is very helpful. So it's 10 minutes after 8. So we will begin to wrap up. The audience will see that Roz just put a poll up. So if I could ask the folks who are here to answer that. Monica, you had a couple people who commented that it was really nice to finally see what you look like after reading your writing and hearing you on radio for so long. I'm deeply grateful. I will say personally, I was trying to be restrained about it, and I still highlighted 63 things in your book. I went through and counted today. I'm like, yeah, that's what I thought. So it was amazing writing. We appreciate it so very much. And I have to give a thank you to the other libraries who worked with us, and in particular to Roz from Vernon Hills and Beth Keller from Highland Park, who managed kind of the technical side of the Zoom. So thank you very much for being with us. We really appreciate your time and your authenticity and your willingness to share. Meant a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great
Thanks,
night.
everyone. Have a good night.